Well folks, it's 1984. The home computer boom is well and truly up and running on a global scale. The Commodore 64 is selling in big numbers worldwide, the Sinclair ZX Spectrum is starting to set fire to the UK market and develop a whole generation of home coders, and various other systems from manufacturers such as Timex, Apple and Texas Instruments are selling well as well. Anyway, into this market, Commodore decided that they needed to introduce a new machine, a low-cost machine to replace their aging VIC-20 system. Now, looking at the competitors in the market that Commodore were aiming at for this sub-$100 system, systems weren't that powerful, but they were certainly more powerful than the venerable VIC-20 was. So, Commodore hatched a plan, and that plan was the Commodore 16 and its partner system, the Commodore 16 Plus 4. Now, in this video, I'm just looking at the Commodore 16 for the simple fact I had one. It was the first home computer that I had and that I sat down with at home after using a BBC Micro in school and begging my parents to buy me a computer. So, let's start off with a quick rundown of the Commodore 16 and its technical specifications. Now, like every machine Commodore was manufacturing at the time, it was based around a MOS technology chip. In the Commodore 16, it was either a 7501 or an 8501, which ran at a variable speed of between 0.89 and 1.6 megahertz. The Commodore 16, as the name implies, shipped with 16K of RAM and a 32K ROM, which did include a basic interpreter. Now, the system was mostly powered by the TED chip. This dealt with a lot of functions that were dealt with on, say, machines like the Commodore 64 by discrete chips. So the TED handled both the video and the audio for the system. Now, unlike the Commodore 64 with its 16 colour palette, the TED offered the Commodore 16 and its partner system Plus 4 up to 121 colours in its palette, significantly higher. However, it didn't have hardware sprites, and the sound capabilities, whilst significantly better than the VIC-20, were not as advanced as the Commodore 64's already iconic SID chip. However, these specs mean nothing without the software, and unfortunately, this is where the Commodore 16 really did fail. You see, the Commodore 16 was launched into a market in 1984 where an entry-level system with 16K of RAM was fast becoming obsolete. The Commodore 64 itself had 64K of RAM. In Europe, the Sinclair Spectrum had 48K of RAM, and within a couple of years would find that bumped up to 128K of RAM. And even the Commodore 16 Plus 4 model shipped with 64K of RAM as opposed to 16. And obviously, the less RAM you have, the less complicated you can make the games and other software. Another factor that really didn't play in Commodore's favour with this was that 16K of RAM was shared between all your game's logic and the screen, which, you know, meant you were giving up some RAM to display the graphics, and this was noticeable in some titles such as the Commodore 16 port of Saboteur. Now, I'm not going to say that this was the sole reason the Commodore 16 failed. Far from it. The reason it failed was a lack of support. Despite being released to the market as a low-cost option, that market just wasn't interested. People didn't want a low-cost entry-level system at that point. They were already looking to the Commodore 64 and its ilk for that more powerful computer experience. And Commodore themselves, as would often be the case, basically threw the machine onto the market and let it sink or swim, something Commodore became very, very adept at during the 1980s. Now, as I said, I owned a Commodore 16, and I really loved it at the time. You know, to a 5-6-year-old kid, this was amazing. And yeah, there were some good games produced for it, as you'll see, but there were also some truly terrible ones. So, without further ado, let's have a look at a handful of games here, just to show you what the Commodore 16 was capable of, and perhaps why it did fail in the market. So I'm going to start with what I consider to be the best of the games here, and this was all the first games I had for my Commodore 16, Galaxions, which is obviously a knockoff of Namco's Galaxians. And as you can see, it looks pretty good. It's nice and colourful, it's pretty smooth, and you know, it plays pretty darn well. I mean, I've got a lot better at it these days as I've got older compared to how interesting I was at it when I was a kid, but it's, you know, it's a pretty faithful adaptation in, you know, a 16K system. I mean, this game probably used all of what, 12 or so K, so I think that's all that was really accessible, but you know, it looks pretty good. The sound effects are pretty decent, and it's probably the best example that I can recall of a Commodore 16 game. Now, obviously, you know, more powerful systems would have better versions of this, but you know, if this was the first thing you saw for the Commodore 16, as it was for me, you'd be pretty darn impressed with how good it was. Now, let's move on to something else which is technically equally as impressive, but maybe not as fun. Now, this is another one of the early games I had on my Commodore 16, Mastodon's Formula 1 Simulator. Now, as you can see, the graphics are fairly basic, but nice and, you know, identifiable. Lovely little bit of background there, and the sensation of speed is really rather good. Sound effects are pretty decent as well. You know, it's smooth. I mean, let's be fair, there are Commodore 64 racing games that aren't as smooth as this, and it does the job. It's not the greatest Formula 1 game of all. You know, there were certainly better Formula 1 games that appeared later on machines like the Commodore 64, the Sinclair Spectrum, the Apple II, but, you know, for a 16K microcomputer, this is pretty darn impressive, but still, even by 1984 standards, it's one track and simple. Get round as many times as you can was a little bit basic in comparison to what else was out there on the market. And you know, one track, it's only going to hold your attention for so long. Now, this game I hate. I'm not going to lie. I actually bought this. I remember buying it. It was $1.99, which to a young kid in sort of 85, 86 was pretty, you know, was a good chunk of my pocket money. But it was BMX, and I was really, really up for it. And then I played it. Oh dear Lord, this game is bad. The scrolling is a little jerky. The controls are frankly terrible. And it's not a fun experience, and it looks almost comedically simplistic. You know, this looks like it could have been coded in BASIC. It's that bad, it really is. Yet this is what companies were releasing, and allegedly BMX Simulator across all formats was BMX Racer was Mastertronic's biggest selling title of all time. I mean, this version certainly wasn't, because it is utter dross. And it's an indicator again of the limits of the system with its 16K of RAM. It just, anything that goes beyond the simplicity of this level of game, you're going to struggle. And this game for me is the nail in the coffin. Saboteur for the C16. Look at it. Tiny little window to fit it into the 16K of system memory. Basic beyond belief graphics. I mean, Manic Miner on the Spectrum was looking better than this 2 years prior. More than 2 years. This was released in 1986. When you think about what was being released on other platforms in 1986, even other versions of this game, this is woefully basic in comparison. This is why the Commodore 16 failed. This was what people were producing based on the games that appeared on the other formats of the time, and it's shockingly bad. Even in 1984 this would have looked bad. Even in 1982 for the Spectrum this would have been bad. And yeah, it's terrible. This is what killed the Commodore 16 beyond Commodore's frankly poor marketing. I'm just going to stop here. So there, the Commodore 16, why it failed. Yes, I have a huge amount of nostalgia for this system, but ultimately, like all machines of the time, it lived and died in the home market based on its games. And shoddy Commodore marketing aside, which was pretty much par for the course, the Commodore 16 just did not have the games to compete. 16K of RAM in 1984 was already way behind the curve. Trying to fit games into that 16K was a ridiculous challenge for even the most talented coders, and provided you stuck to something simple like Galaxians or the Formula 1 game, you could do quite well. Although BMX Racers does belie the fact that simple means good. Try to do something more complicated like an arcade adventure such as Saboteur and you can see why the machine was kneecapped. So yeah, the Commodore 16, some great stuff in there with its hardware, but ultimately doomed to failure by being ultimately under-specced and under-marketed by Commodore. Anyway, I've been Learned Rob. This is a 1632-bit. If you've enjoyed this video, do hit the like and subscribe buttons. If you really enjoyed it, ring the bell to see the next video that I produce. And if you want to help me out, there's links for Patreon and Ko-fi that you can click on to offer your assistance. If not, just leave comments. They're all good. I take all the feedback on board and I'm very grateful to everyone who watches these videos. So, without further ado, as I said, my name's Rob and I bid you adieu.